It was upon a damp and fog-laden morning in early November that I was roused from my slumber by a sharp rapping at the door of our Baker Street lodgings. Holmes, who had been awake for hours, as I could tell from the faint curl of smoke that seeped under the crack of his bedroom door, summoned the visitor with a laconic, "Come in." A moment later, Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade, his thin frame glistening with the moisture of the London fog. He looked unusually grave, even for a man accustomed to sights that would chill the blood of lesser souls. "Holmes," said Lestrade, wasting no time on courtesies, "I've come about St. Swithin's Crypt." Holmes, still in his dressing gown, set aside his violin and motioned for Lestrade to continue. His keen eyes glittered with interest, though he did not speak. "A sexton was found there at dawn, dead upon the stone floor," the inspector explained. "Not a mark of violence upon him, and yet— well, there's the matter of the candles." "Candles?" I asked, perplexed. Lestrade's brow furrowed. "5 of them, Doctor, arranged in a perfect circle about the body, all burned down to the same length. The sexton, one Jeremiah Briggs, was a sober, God-fearing man by all accounts, no quarrels, no debts. Yet there he lay, cold as the grave he kept, surrounded by candles, as though in some devilish ritual." Holmes leaned back, steepling his long fingers beneath his chin. "A circle of 5, he murmured. "Curious. Did the sexton light them himself, I wonder? Or were they lit for him?" "There's more," Lestrade said, lowering his voice. "The crypt doors were locked from the inside. We had to break them open." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden intensity. "A locked chamber, an inexplicable death, and a ritualistic arrangement of candles. My dear Watson, we may well have before us a case worthy of our fullest energies." And thus began that most singular affair which I have set down here as the case of the 5 candles in the crypt, an investigation that drew us into the shadowed heart of London's oldest churchyards, where superstition and reason would do battle in the most curious fashion. The day was still young when Lestrade left our rooms, having pressed upon Holmes the urgency of the matter and secured his promise to attend at St. Swithin's within the hour. Yet Holmes was in no haste to quit Baker Street. Instead, he busied himself with a languid breakfast of cold ham and coffee, glancing now and again toward the grey window, as if measuring the thickness of the fog against his own inclination to venture into it. "You appear singularly unconcerned, Holmes," I remarked at last. "A man is found dead in a church crypt under bizarre circumstances, and you sit here with the serenity of a philosopher contemplating his toast." Holmes smiled faintly and dabbed his lips with a napkin. "My dear Watson, serenity is the surest ally of reason. To hurl oneself blindly at a puzzle is to miss its essence. One must first accustom the mind to stillness, so that each fact may drop into place like a piece upon a chessboard." I shook my head, though accustomed by now to his curious habits. "Then you already perceive something in the inspector's account which escaped me?" Holmes leaned back in his chair, his piercing eyes half veiled beneath drooping lids. "Tell me, Watson, what do you make of the number 5? "The number 5? I should think very little. It might be a matter of chance. 5 candles at hand in the church, nothing more." Holmes chuckled. "Chance, my dear fellow, is a word we use when we cannot see the threads. Consider. Had there been 4 candles, one might suppose a cruciform arrangement. 6 might suggest symmetry in pairs. But 5 arranged in a circle, carries with it a symbolism not to be overlooked. Human superstition clings to odd numbers, and the pentacle has been invested for centuries with mystical significance. We tread upon ground where ignorance and fear are as potent as fact. It is always dangerous, Watson, to dismiss what others may have taken the utmost trouble to contrive." He rose, lit a cigarette, and paced before the fire. But let us leave speculation until we have observed the scene ourselves. Lestrade, poor fellow, will see only ritual and whisperings of the diabolic. It is for us to discern whether those candles conceal artifice of a more worldly kind. Before we set out, Holmes astonished me, as he often did, with one of those seemingly trivial observations which revealed his uncanny powers of perception. He halted suddenly at the window where a tradesman's boy was loitering in the street below with a wicker basket of bread. "Observe that lad, Watson. What do you see?" "Nothing remarkable. He carries loaves for his master's delivery and is idling rather than making haste." Holmes' eyes twinkled. "And yet from the very swing of his basket one may perceive that it is lighter now than when he set out. Notice also the flower upon his sleeve and the faint mark of paste upon his collar. It is evident he took it upon himself to sample his wares before commencing his errand." "Really, Holmes, you cannot be serious." "On the contrary, I am quite serious. There is a faint smear upon the left corner of his mouth, betraying the indulgence of a hurried bite. The missing loaf, of course, will later be blamed upon some street urchin, and our young baker will preserve his guilty secret, unless, perhaps, someone more observant than his employer chances to remark it. I dare say this will serve as a modest illustration of how appearances deceive. Remember it well when we stand among the shadows of St. Swithin's." With that curious prelude, we at last donned our coats, Holmes securing his Inverness cape about his shoulders, and made our way into the foggy streets. The journey to St. Swithin's took us eastward, through the labyrinthine alleys of the city, where the smoke of industry mingled with the acrid breath of the Thames. Horse hoofs rang upon the cobbles, muffled by the rolling mist, and the lamps stood like phantoms against the gloom. Holmes, silent and intent, strode at a pace which compelled me to keep close at his side. St. Swithin's proved to be a modest but venerable edifice, its stone darkened by centuries of London soot. The spire rose sharp into the fog, while its adjoining graveyard stretched like a ragged quilt of leaning headstones and crumbling tombs. The churchwarden, a thin, anxious man named Pritchard, met us at the gate and ushered us quickly within. "I cannot account for it, gentlemen," he whispered, in a voice more suited to a sick-room than the open air. Briggs was a steady soul. To find him lying there among the coffins, it chills me to the bone. The parish folk will have it there's witchcraft at work. Holmes dismissed the man's fears with a curt nod and motioned for Lestrade, who awaited us at the crypt entrance. Together we descended a narrow flight of steps, our footsteps echoing dully upon the worn stone. The air grew colder and danker as we went, until at last we stood in a chamber whose vaulted roof dripped with moisture, and whose walls were lined with alcoves containing the slumbering dead. There upon the flagstone floor lay the body of Jeremiah Briggs, stretched upon his back with arms rigid at his sides. His face bore no mark of violence, but was fixed in a grimace, as though death had surprised him with a sudden pang. About him, at precise intervals, stood 5 stubs of candle, their wax pooled upon the stone in perfect uniformity. Holmes knelt at once beside the corpse, his keen gaze roving over every detail. He touched the melted wax lightly with his long finger, sniffed at the wick, and even held one stub close to his nose. "Common tallow," he murmured, "nothing ecclesiastical about them. Such candles may be had in any chandlery. Note also, Watson, the evenness of their length. They were lit at precisely the same time and extinguished at nearly the same moment. A careful hand arranged this tableau. Then you think, Holmes, that the candles are but an artifice, an attempt to suggest some unholy ritual? Not think, Watson, observe. Briggs was a sexton, a man accustomed to churchly rites. Had he, in some fit of delirium, attempted such a scene, it would bear the stamp of irregularity, of impulse. Instead, we see symmetry, precision, deliberation. This was contrived by another mind, one that wished to convey terror, not truth. Holmes bent closer to the body, drawing from his pocket a small, magnifying lens. He scrutinized the man's lips, his fingernails, and at last the hem of his coarse coat. Then, without comment, he rose and began to pace slowly about the crypt, tapping the stones with his stick and peering into shadowed recesses. Lestrade watched him with evident impatience. "Well, Mr. Holmes, what do you make of it? Poison, perhaps? Or did his heart simply give out from fright?" Holmes regarded him with that peculiar half-smile which signalled both amusement and disdain. "I make of it, Inspector, that you are too ready to provide a cause where none yet appears. The heart may indeed have failed, but the cause of its failure is hidden still. We shall not reach it by guesses. Then what do you suggest? That we treat this place as what it is, a locked chamber. The door was bolted from within, you say?" "Aye, Briggs alone held the key." "Then either Briggs himself secured the door after admitting his assailant, unlikely, or we are in the presence of an agency most ingenious. You may be certain, Lestrade, that no ghost passed through those stones. The solution is here, in this chamber, awaiting the eye that can discern it." Holmes's gaze lingered upon a patch of damp mortar near the eastern wall, then upon a scatter of dust displaced upon the flagstones. His nostrils flared slightly, as though scenting some odour imperceptible to others. But he made no remark, only turned away and ascended once more into the chill daylight, his face set in that mask of abstract thought which I had come to know as the herald of his most profound exertions. Outside, the fog was lifting slightly, and the bells of St. Swithin's told the noon hour. Holmes paused upon the steps and drew his cloak tighter about him. "Watson," he said softly, "there are wheels within wheels here. We are confronted not merely with the death of a sexton, but with a contrivance meant to mock the very faculties of reason. It is our task to show that even in the crypt's shadow, logic holds sway." His eyes gleamed with an almost fierce delight. "Come, my dear fellow, we have much yet to learn of Jeremiah Briggs, and still more of those who feared or envied him. The candles may be extinguished, but the trail they cast is yet alight." And with that pronouncement, Holmes set off into the fog once more, Lestrade hurrying at his side, while I followed, my mind teeming with more questions than answers. Holmes walked with long, energetic strides that carried us down the slope of Ludgate Hill and across into the narrower byways adjoining the Fleet. Lestrade kept pace gamely, notebook in hand, though more than once he threw me a helpless glance, as if to ask whether I could decipher the workings of Holmes's restless mind. "Where are we bound?" I asked, for Holmes had not declared his destination. "To the living before the dead, Watson. It is folly to stare at a corpse until one has acquainted oneself with the life that preceded it. We shall begin with those who knew Jeremiah Briggs, for a man's end is seldom divorced from his habits." We soon reached a cluster of dingy houses that leaned like conspirators toward one another above a narrow lane. Here the sexton had lodged in modest rooms provided by the parish. The churchwarden, Mr. Pritchard, had furnished us with the key, and now he accompanied us reluctantly, muttering that he disliked intruding upon the affairs of the dead. Briggs's chamber was a poor but tidy place, a narrow bed, a chest of drawers polished by long use, and a shelf of devotional books whose pages bore the stain of candle smoke. Upon the table lay a set of tools, a small hammer, nails, and chisels for tending to coffins and vaults. There was also, curiously, a brass tinder-box and a supply of ordinary tallow candles, half-burned. Holmes examined these items with care. "You see, Watson," he said, "our sexton had no want of candles, yet those in the crypt were of identical cut and size, fresh from a shop. Already the hand of another becomes apparent." While he busied himself thus, Lestrade rummaged through the drawers with an officious air. "Nothing here but hymnals and pious tracts," he said. The man was devout enough, if that counts for anything. Holmes said nothing, but stooped to pick from beneath the bed a pair of boots, the soles of which were thick with the dust of the crypt. He measured their impression against a scrap of paper, then set them aside with a thoughtful frown. It was then that a timid knock sounded at the door. A young woman of rustic appearance entered, twisting her hands in her apron. She was introduced as Sarah Briggs, the niece of the deceased. "I came to fetch his belongings," she said softly. "Uncle Jeremiah had no wife nor child, and I am his only kin." Her eyes filled with tears as they strayed to the bed, but Holmes, with characteristic abruptness, addressed her at once. "Your uncle was in good health yesterday?" "As far as I know, sir. He complained of a little weariness at times, but nothing beyond what hard work brings." "And did he speak of any trouble, quarrel, or fear?" She shook her head. "Never. He was a gentle man, always reading his Bible, never raising his voice. He kept to himself." Holmes regarded her keenly. "And yet, Miss Briggs, a man may keep to himself and still incur enmity. Do you know of any who bore him ill will?" She hesitated, twisting her apron more tightly. "There were those in the parish who laughed at him. They called him the keeper of ghosts, because he tended the crypt so faithfully. Some lads would taunt him in the street, saying he kept company with the dead more than the living, but he bore it patiently." Her voice faltered, and she turned away. Holmes, uncharacteristically gentle, inclined his head and allowed her to depart without further questioning. When she was gone, Lestrade closed his notebook with a snap. "A harmless fellow, mocked by fools, that is the picture I get, and yet he ends with candles round him like some wizard's victim. I cannot make sense of it." Holmes only smiled, slipping his magnifying lens into his pocket. "Patience, Inspector. A picture begun in broad strokes must yet be finished, with finer lines." We next called upon the parish clerk, a round, red-faced man named Cottle, whose ink-stained fingers testified to years of recording christenings, marriages, and burials. He received us in his office, surrounded by dusty ledgers. "Jeremiah Briggs," he said, puffing upon a clay pipe. "A steady chap. Did his duty well enough, though some said he was too fond of lingering in the crypt when the work was done. Strange fancies, perhaps." "What fancies?" Holmes asked sharply. The clerk hesitated. "Well, he'd mutter that the stones had voices, that he could hear whisperings when the candles guttered. I dare say it was only the wind or rats in the walls, but the talk made folks uneasy. A sexton ought not to feed superstitions, you see." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "So he was thought an oddity. And did anyone profit by his death?" Cottle shrugged. "He had little enough to leave. A few shillings, perhaps. The niece will have them." Holmes glanced at me significantly, but made no reply. That afternoon, Holmes insisted upon revisiting the crypt, though Lestrade protested he had already scoured it thoroughly. Armed with a lantern, Holmes descended the steps once more and bade us hold silence. For several minutes he moved about the chamber in complete stillness, pausing to crouch here, to press his ear to the wall there. At last he beckoned me. "Observe this stone, Watson. The mortar about it is crumbled, as though recently disturbed. The dust upon the floor beneath it has been displaced. Would you not say that someone sought to pry it loose?" I bent down, but saw only a faint irregularity. "It might be the work of damp, Holmes. Stone does not last forever in such a place." True, but note also the scrape upon the flag directly below, as if a tool had slipped. Damp does not wield a chisel. Lestrade snorted. And what of it? A stone loosened in a crypt means little. On the contrary, it may mean everything. Ask yourself, Inspector, why should a sexton who spent his life in this place disturb one stone above all others, and why should he be found dead upon that very floor the next morning? Lestrade was silenced by this, though plainly unconvinced. Holmes, however, was not finished. He moved to the centre of the chamber and considered once more the circle of candles. They were set to draw the eye here, to make us forget the walls and think only of the corpse. A conjurer's trick, Watson, misdirection. The candles are not the mystery, but the veil drawn across it. His voice, low and deliberate, echoed among the stone arches. In that dim, chilling place, his words carried a weight that made even my stout heart quail. We left the crypt as dusk gathered once more over London, and returned to Baker Street in silence. Holmes flung himself into his chair, clasped his hands and closed his eyes. For near an hour he did not stir, while I busied myself with writing my notes of the day's observations. At last he spoke. "There is a key, Watson, and it lies in Briggs's habits. A solitary man, mocked by neighbours, whispering of voices among the stones. He alone knew some secret of that crypt, and for that knowledge he has paid with his life. The candles were meant to suggest the supernatural, but behind them lurks a very human hand." "You believe, then, that he was murdered?" Holmes's eyes opened, and the keen fire within them startled me. "I believe, Watson, that we stand upon the edge of a labyrinth, and unless I am greatly mistaken, another turn in that dark maze will present itself before long. We must be ready." His words proved prophetic, for even as he spoke, a sharp knock sounded below, and Mrs. Hudson's hurried step came upon the stair. She entered, pale and anxious. "A message for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, holding out a folded paper. "A boy brought it. He would not give his name." Holmes seized the note and unfolded it. I saw his brows knit as he read. Without a word, he passed it to me. Upon the page, scrawled in a rough hand, were the words, "Leave the crypt be. The dead do not sleep easy. Meddle further, and more will follow Briggs." A silence fell upon the room. The fire snapped in the grate, and the fog pressed heavy at the window. Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled, his voice scarcely above a whisper. "So, Watson, it begins." The ominous message lay upon the table between us, its crude scrawl a stark challenge in the flickering lamplight. Holmes regarded it with the air of one weighing not the words themselves, but the character of the hand that had formed them. "You perceive, Watson," he said at length, "the irregularity of the script, the uneven strokes, the clumsy spacing. One might assume an uneducated hand, but I would advise against hasty conclusions. A disguise, even of handwriting, is not beyond the simplest cunning." "And the warning?" I asked. "It is clear enough that someone fears discovery." "Or desires us to believe so," Holmes countered. He rose and paced before the fire, his dressing-gown sweeping behind him. "There is mischief here. The dead do not rise to issue threats. A living adversary hides behind this mask of superstition. The more they insist upon phantoms, the more certain I am of human agency." Lestrade, who had lingered with us, struck the table with his fist. "Then let us set men to watch the crypt and the graveyard. This scoundrel will return to his work, and we shall nab him red-handed." Holmes smiled thinly. "You propose to station constables in the fog among the tombs. Imagine the effect upon the parish folk when word spreads that even Scotland Yard expects spectres." "No, Inspector, we shall pursue a quieter line. We must consider who profits by Briggs's death, who feared what he knew, and who now seeks to cloak their deed in terror." At this he took up his violin and drew from it a low, contemplative air. It was his custom when grappling with some thorny problem. I could tell by the taut line of his mouth that he was already turning over names in his mind, testing each against the strange tableau we had witnessed in the crypt. The following morning dawned damp and murky, as though London itself conspired to shroud its secrets. Holmes, brisk now with energy, declared we must visit the parish again to pursue inquiries among the townsfolk. "Let us see, Watson, what shadows human nature casts in this little corner of the city. The dead have spoken. It is the living who must answer." We set out together with Lestrade, arriving once more at St. Swithin's as the bells tolled 8. A small knot of parishioners loitered at the gate, whispering among themselves. Their glances followed us with mingled awe and suspicion, for already rumours had spread of unholy rites and spectral warnings. Holmes passed through them without notice and directed us first to the churchwarden, Mr. Pritchard, whom we had briefly encountered before. The man received us in his office, his pale face betraying the strain of recent events. "You must understand, gentlemen," he said anxiously, "the parish cannot endure scandal. Already there is talk of closing the crypt to visitors. If word of witchcraft attaches itself to St. Swithin's, we shall lose half our flock." Holmes fixed him with his penetrating gaze. "Your concern is commendable, Mr. Pritchard. Yet I must ask, had you any cause to quarrel with your sexton?" "None, sir. Briggs was diligent, if eccentric. He knew the crypt better than any man living. Why, he could name each stone and tell you the history of every coffin within. He was indispensable." Holmes nodded. "Indispensable men sometimes know more than is convenient. Did he ever speak of discoveries beneath your church?" The churchwarden flushed. "Idle fancies only, whispers of hidden vaults and such. I paid them no heed. Surely you cannot suppose—" "I suppose nothing, Mr. Pritchard. I merely observe." The man shifted uneasily, and I could not help but notice the perspiration upon his brow, though the morning was chill. From the churchwarden we passed to other voices of the parish. One was Mrs. Hardacre, the charwoman who scrubbed the church floors. A formidable matron with arms red from lye, she spoke with blunt conviction. "Mark me, sirs, that Briggs had dealings best left alone. I saw him once with a stranger in the graveyard, whispering in the dark of evening, a tall man, wrapped in a cloak. I challenged him, but they slunk away like guilty things. And now Briggs lies cold, with candles about him. There's more in it than godliness, you may depend upon it." Lestrade pricked up his ears. "A stranger, you say? Tall? Cloaked? That is something we can work with." But Holmes only inquired calmly, "Did you note the stranger's face?" "No, sir." He turned aside and the fog was thick, but his step was quick like one used to command. Holmes inclined his head, but offered no comment. Later that day we sought out Sarah Briggs once more, finding her in her modest lodgings. Her grief had softened into a pale resignation, but she received us courteously. "My uncle kept no enemies," she insisted. "Yet I know he was troubled these last weeks. He spoke less, and oftentimes he would sit staring into the fire, muttering of secrets that weighed upon him. When I pressed him, he bade me ask no more, for silence was safer." Her words struck a chord of unease in me. "Did he fear someone, Miss Briggs?" She lowered her eyes. "Perhaps. Once I found him startled by a knock at the door. He thrust a paper into the fire and watched till it was ash. I cannot tell what it contained." Holmes listened intently, his fingers drumming upon the arm of his chair. "Your uncle confided little, but you observe keenly. That paper may prove more eloquent than any sermon. Tell me, Miss Briggs, did you recognize the hand that delivered the warning we showed you yesterday?" She shook her head in perplexity. "No, sir, I cannot say." By evening, Lestrade was flushed with the conviction that the mysterious cloaked stranger was our man. "Here we have it plain," he declared as we returned to Baker Street. "Briggs met someone in secret, feared him, burned papers to conceal knowledge. Then the fellow silenced him, dressing the scene with candles to frighten us off. A villain, sure enough. We need only to scour the parish for any tall man of menacing aspect." Holmes smiled with dry amusement. "Your net will gather half the city, Inspector. Tall men in cloaks are plentiful in November fogs. No, we must not be led by the nose. Misdirection lies thick about us. The cloaked figure may be the very bait intended to draw your energies away from the truth." I ventured. "And what then is the truth, Holmes?" He looked at me keenly. "That is precisely what we have yet to learn, but observe. Each testimony places Briggs as a man guarding a secret, not merely performing his duties. His solitude, his mutterings, the paper he destroyed, all point to knowledge hidden within that crypt. And knowledge, Watson, is the most perilous possession of all." He rose, restless once more, and flung open the window. The fog pressed in like a living shroud. "Someone fears what Briggs discovered. Until we learn what that is, we chase phantoms." It was near midnight when the first tangible consequence of our inquiries arrived. A messenger brought news that startled even Holmes into stillness. Another figure had been discovered in the graveyard of St. Swithin's, alive but grievously injured. The man was described as a beggar who often slept among the tombs. He had been found senseless with a wound upon his head and muttering incoherently about lights in the crypt. Holmes turned sharply to me. "You see, Watson, the stakes rise. Another victim, though spared. Death testifies to the same unseen hand. This is no isolated crime. It is a pattern unfolding, and we must be swift if we are to prevent yet further tragedy." His eyes burned with that strange fire of anticipation that so often presaged his greatest triumphs. Yet, even as he spoke, I could not shake the sense that we moved deeper into peril, the fog closing ever tighter about us. The news of the beggar's assault roused Holmes to immediate action. Within the quarter hour, we had wrapped ourselves against the damp chill and hailed a cab for the hospital where the unfortunate man had been conveyed. Holmes sat in taut silence, the brim of his hat casting his features in shadow, while Lestrade muttered darkly of ruffians and cutpurses who would make a graveyard their hunting ground. "Criminals prey where the eye is least likely to fall," Holmes said curtly. "Yet this attack has more method than mere vagrancy. My words, Inspector, Briggs's death and this new outrage are bound by a common thread." The man in question lay upon a narrow cot in a ward heavy with the odour of carbolic. His head was bandaged, and his face, gaunt and weathered, twitched as though still troubled by the visions of his delirium. When the physician gave us leave, Holmes bent low over the fellow and addressed him in a voice at once firm and gentle. "Your name, my good man?" The beggar's eyes fluttered open. "Joe," he stammered. "Joe Palmer." "And what befell you, Joe Palmer? Speak plainly." The man licked his parched lips. "Light, sir, down in the stones, a glow from under the church. I went to look, and summit struck me down. A shadow with hands. Didn't see the face." "Did you see candles?" Lestrade pressed. "Aye, candles. But not like them church ones. These was all in a row, burning where no flame should be." His strength faltered, and he sank back upon the pillow, muttering of phantoms and curses. Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. "There is truth in his rambling, though buried beneath fear," he said softly. "Lights beneath the church, what say you, Watson? Our sexton muttered of voices, and now a beggar of glows. Do not dismiss them as madness too swiftly." Lestrade scoffed. "Tavern tales, the both of them. Ghosts and glimmers. You'll see, Mr. Holmes, some common thief uses the crypt for his lair, and Briggs stumbled upon him." Holmes gave no answer. He merely studied the beggar once more, his gaze lingering on the man's boots, caked with mud of a peculiar reddish hue. He stooped to pinch a dried fleck between his fingers, then, with an almost imperceptible smile, secreted it into his pocketbook. I noted the action but refrained from comment, for I knew that look well. Holmes had seen something of significance, yet chose for the moment to keep it veiled. When we returned to Baker Street, Holmes fell into one of his long silences. He lay upon the sofa, his eyes fixed upon the ceiling, while curls of smoke from his pipe writhed into the air like question marks. Lestrade, impatient as ever, demanded to know his opinion. "Opinion is the luxury of the unobservant," Holmes said. "For myself, I am content with facts. Briggs is dead, a beggar is assaulted, and in both cases we hear of unnatural light in the crypt. That, Inspector, is fact enough for the present." Lestrade muttered something about riddles and took his leave, promising to set constables about the parish, regardless of Holmes's caution. When the door had closed, I ventured, "You have observed something, Holmes. I saw you pocket that scrap of soil. Surely it bears upon the case." He smiled faintly. "Ah, Watson, your eyes grow sharper. Yes, I took a fragment, but whether it is a key or a trifle, time alone will tell. For the moment it is my secret. A single thread is nothing unless it can be woven into a pattern." I confess I felt a pang of frustration, for there were times when Holmes's secrecy seemed less the result of prudence than of sheer perversity. Yet I knew from experience that pressing him was useless. He would speak when the tapestry was ready, and not before. That evening, as we supped together, Mrs. Hudson announced another visitor. To my surprise, it was the parish clerk, Mr. Cottle, his round face now pale, and his manner deeply agitated. "I beg your pardon, gentlemen," he said, wringing his ink-stained hands, "but I can keep silence no longer. There are matters concerning poor Briggs that must be told." Holmes motioned him to a chair. "Pray proceed, Mr. Cottle. Truth kept too long may become as dangerous as falsehood." The clerk swallowed hard. "It is this. Briggs came to me a fortnight ago, in great perturbation. He had found something in the crypt, something hidden behind the stones. He would not say what, but he feared it was not lawful. He asked my advice whether to tell the churchwarden. I urged him to wait, for Pritchard is not a man to bear scandal lightly." Briggs agreed, but he trembled as he left me. Holmes leaned forward, his keen gaze like a lance. "Did he show you the object?" "No, sir. Only said it was old, and dangerous if known." "Dangerous to whom?" Cottle shook his head helplessly. "I cannot say." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then dismissed him with a nod. When the clerk had gone, he turned to me with a glint in his eye. "You see, Watson, our sexton was guardian of a secret, perhaps unwitting, but dangerous nonetheless. It was not death that sought him, but silence. Someone feared the revelation of what he had uncovered. And the candles. A mask, my dear fellow, always a mask, but of what? That remains the question. The days that followed brought no respite. Constables stationed near St. Swithin's reported furtive figures glimpsed in the fog, though none could be apprehended. Parishioners whispered that the church was accursed, and several refused to enter after sundown. Lestrade was convinced that a gang of thieves used the crypt as their hiding place. Yet Holmes was not swayed by such easy explanations. On the third evening, he returned from some solitary errand, with his eyes alight and his step uncommonly brisk. "Watson," he exclaimed, "I have traced the source of that reddish soil from the beggar's boots. It comes not from the churchyard, but from a particular stretch along the Thames embankment, where the clay is exposed by recent works. What business had Joe Palmer there before his assault? More to the point, what connection links that place with the secrets of St. Swithin's? Before I could hazard a reply, he grew suddenly grave. Say nothing of this to Lestrade, not yet. The pattern is still incomplete, and the premature tugging of threads may unravel the whole. Thus, once more, he consigned me to the darkness of his secrecy, leaving me only with the knowledge that some vital clue had been seized and locked away within his singular brain. The tension deepened that very night. As we prepared for rest, a stone clattered against the window of our sitting room. Holmes sprang to it at once, but the street below lay empty save for the swirling mist. Upon the sill, however, he discovered a scrap of paper weighted with a pebble. Unfolding it, we read the same rough scrawl as before. "Be warned, the candles burn for more than the dead. The next flame shall be for you." I started involuntarily, but Holmes only laughed, though there was little mirth in the sound. "Threats are the tribute paid by fear to knowledge, Watson. We are upon the right path, else they would not trouble to warn us." He crumpled the note and tossed it into the fire, where it flared and was consumed. Then he turned to me with that peculiar gleam which signalled the stirring of some grand design. "Rest well, my friend. Tomorrow we take a step deeper into this labyrinth. And though I hold my tongue for now, be assured I have seen a crack in the darkness through which the light begins to fall." The following day dawned bleak and storm-tossed. Rain lashed the panes of Baker Street in sudden gusts, and the roar of wind through the chimney gave a mournful accompaniment to our breakfast. Holmes, however, seemed curiously invigorated by the tempest. His eyes shone with that unnatural brightness which I had come to associate with the quickening of his mental powers, though I noted also the restless tapping of his fingers and the abruptness of his movements, signs that the case had worked its fever into his very veins. "Watson," he said, setting down his coffee untasted, "the noose tightens. Our adversary grows reckless, else we should not have been warned twice. When criminals issue threats, it is because they are cornered." "And yet," I ventured, "we remain in ignorance of their true design. We know only of candles, crypts, and whisperings in the dark." Holmes gave a quick, mirthless laugh. "Ignorance to you, Watson. To me the pattern grows daily clearer, but we must not speak of conclusions until they are woven beyond dispute." Before I could press him further, Lestrade was announced. The inspector's face was pale and drawn, and his manner betrayed an agitation most unusual in that stolid officer. "There has been another outrage, Mr. Holmes," he said, thrusting a damp cap upon the peg. "The churchwarden, Pritchard, is dead." I started violently. "Dead? Good heavens, how?" "Found this morning in his own office, slumped across the desk, door locked on the inside, windows fast. Same as Briggs, no mark of violence, no struggle, and—" He hesitated, glancing uneasily at Holmes. "5 candles, gentlemen, set about him in a circle, each burned to the same length." For a moment even I was struck dumb. The recurrence of that eerie signature chilled me to the bone. But Holmes only leapt to his feet, his whole frame tense with a kind of fierce excitement. "At last!" he cried. "The pattern declares itself. Come, Watson, there is no time to lose. We must view the scene at once." We hurried through the storm-swept streets, the cab wheels splashing through gutters swollen with rain. At St. Swithin's parish house we found the narrow chamber where Pritchard had breathed his last. The body lay across the desk, head pillowed upon scattered papers. His face bore an expression of startled pain, but no wound. About him, sure enough, stood the 5 stubs of candle, guttered and precise as before. The air reeked faintly of smoke and tallow, mingled with the sharper tang of ink. Holmes bent at once to his work. He touched the wick of one candle, examined the pooling wax, and then ran his long fingers lightly across the papers upon the desk. One in particular he scrutinized with his lens, then folded it swiftly and placed it within his pocketbook, saying nothing. Lestrade, meanwhile, wrung his hands. "2 deaths, Mr. Holmes, and both alike. It is the devil's work, I tell you. We shall have a panic in the parish." "Foolishness, Inspector," Holmes retorted sharply. "A devil does not trouble himself with candles and locked doors. These are the devices of mortal cunning. Observe, no signs of poison in the glass, no weapon, yet the man is dead. What remains then? Consider it, Watson. What remains?" I could only shake my head, for the puzzle baffled me utterly. Holmes's eyes glowed with suppressed triumph, but he held his tongue, as though some inner law forbade him to speak before the final stroke. When the body was removed, Holmes directed his attention to the windows. He threw them open despite the lashing rain, and examined the sills minutely. At one he paused, his expression intent. He scraped away some faint deposit with his knife, then slipped it into an envelope. "You see it, Watson?" he asked softly. I leaned close, but perceived only a smear of damp soot. "Nothing remarkable, I fear." "Precisely," Holmes replied enigmatically, and turned away. That evening found us once more at Baker Street, the storm unabated outside, but the fire blazing brightly within. Holmes paced the room like a caged tiger, now pausing to peer into his chemical corner, now striking a discord upon his violin, always with that air of suppressed energy that told me his mind was racing faster than his body could contain. 2 men dead, both guardians of the crypt, both found with candles arranged about them, I mused aloud. It is more than coincidence, Holmes, but what possible end could such murders serve? Holmes wheeled upon me, his eyes blazing. "Ah, Watson, you strike at the very heart of it. What indeed? To kill is one thing, to kill thus theatrically is another. Mark you this, the candles are not ritual but rhetoric. They speak to the eye, to the imagination. They cry aloud, 'This is supernatural. Fear and keep away.' And while the world trembles at shadows, the true purpose is achieved unseen." "And that purpose?" I pressed eagerly. But Holmes had already sunk into his chair, his face once more impassive. "Patience, my dear fellow, all in good time." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Briggs. The poor girl was pale and distraught, yet her eyes blazed with determination. "You must find the villain, Mr. Holmes," she cried. "2 good men gone, and my uncle among them. I cannot rest while his murderer walks free." Holmes bowed gravely. "Rest assured, Miss Briggs, the net draws close. Tell me, have you observed aught amiss since your uncle's death?" She hesitated, then clasped her hands tightly. "I have seen the cloaked man again. 2 nights past in the graveyard. He stood among the stones, watching. When I cried out, he vanished into the fog. I swear it was no fancy." Lestrade leapt up. "There, Holmes! Proof enough! This cloaked rascal is at the bottom of it. With your leave, I'll have every constable in the city searching for him." Holmes's expression was unreadable. "As you will, Inspector. Yet remember, phantoms vanish because we expect them to. The cloaked man may be no more than a puppet whose strings are pulled elsewhere." Sarah shuddered. "Then we are all in peril." Holmes inclined his head. "Perhaps, but knowledge is our shield, fear is their weapon, and we must not yield it." That night, long after our visitor had departed, I found Holmes still wakeful, seated by the fire with his pipe. The storm outside had abated into a sullen drizzle, and the city lay in uneasy quiet. "Watson," he said suddenly, "you recall the beggar's tale of lights beneath the church?" "Certainly." "Tomorrow we shall see for ourselves." There is a way beneath St. Swithin's, a way Briggs discovered and Pritchard sought to suppress. They died for it. We must tread the same path, though the risk is great. I felt a chill despite the fire's warmth. You mean we are to venture into the crypt by night? By night, yes, for by night our adversary works, and if fortune favours us, we shall surprise him in his lair. His voice was low, but the resolve in it was iron. I knew then that the stakes had risen beyond the ordinary, that Holmes had cast himself into the heart of the danger with a will that nothing could divert. As I closed my notebook upon the day's events, I could not shake the sense that we stood upon the brink of some fearful revelation, and that before another dawn broke over London, the shadow of St. Swithin's would deepen into deadly peril. The next evening found Holmes in an unusual state of concentration. He had spent much of the day closeted in his chemical corner, performing delicate experiments upon the fragments of soil and soot gathered from Pritchard's office. His lips were tightly compressed, and he muttered to himself in rapid bursts that I could not follow. At times he laughed softly, and at others his brows knit in a frown so severe that I dared not interrupt. By twilight, however, he had emerged from his abstraction with that peculiar energy of bearing which was always the harbinger of decisive action. He summoned both Lestrade and myself to the sitting-room and laid before us his resolution. Gentlemen, tonight we return to St. Swithin's. The crypt conceals both the truth and the hand that would keep it hidden. Twice have they slain, twice have they mocked us with their circle of candles. Enough! We shall confront them on their chosen ground. And if my calculations be sound, we shall not leave without a face to match the shadow. Lestrade, though uneasy, assented with alacrity. I'll have men posted round the church, he said. They won't slip through our fingers this time. Holmes raised a hand. No, Inspector, too many feet, too many eyes, and our quarry vanishes in the fog like smoke. We must be but three and silent as the grave. Trust me, the fewer we are, the more certain the net. I confess my heart quailed at the thought of entering that dreadful crypt again, and by night, no less. Yet Holmes's calm assurance was a bulwark against fear, and I resolved that where he went, I would follow. We set out at 11, the lamps of the city dim behind veils of drifting mist. The graveyard of St. Swithin's loomed spectral in the moonlight, stones leaning like weary sentinels, while the black yew trees stirred restlessly in the night air. Lestrade muttered an oath as we passed among the tombs, but Holmes strode on with the surety of one who knows his destination. At the crypt door he paused and drew from his pocket a small dark lantern. With a deft movement he turned the light low, and we descended once more into that cold underworld. The chamber was as we had left it, save that the air seemed heavier, more laden with the scent of damp and decay. Holmes extinguished his lamp and bade us crouch among the shadows of a recess. Patience.
Gentlemen, he whispered, our adversary will come. They have unfinished business here, and I have arranged that they should find opportunity tonight. What opportunity? I whispered back. But Holmes merely laid a finger to his lips and fixed his eyes upon the darkened chamber. The hours crawled with dreadful slowness. A single drop of water fell at intervals from the roof, its echo magnified until it seemed like the ticking of some subterranean clock. My nerves were strained to breaking, and even Lestrade, stout as he was, shifted uneasily. At length, near the hour of 2, we heard it, a faint scraping at the outer door, then the stealthy creak of hinges. A thin beam of light pierced the gloom, and a cloaked figure slipped within, bearing a small bundle beneath his arm. He moved with practised caution, pausing to listen, then advancing to the centre of the crypt.
Holmes' hand gripped my sleeve in warning silence. The intruder set down his bundle and withdrew from it 5 fresh candles. One by one, he placed them with studied precision about the stone floor. Then, striking a match, he lit each in turn until once again that eerie circle gleamed upon the flagstones. My heart thudded with horror at the repetition of the dreadful scene. Was another victim to be brought forth for this unholy rite? But Holmes leaned close to my ear. "Observe, Watson, the ritual is not for death, but for concealment. Watch closely." The cloaked man produced from his bundle a small iron tool and turned toward the very wall where Holmes had earlier noted the crumbling mortar. He set himself to work, levering quietly at the loosened stone. Presently it shifted, and he reached within. When his hand emerged, it clutched a small, age-darkened box. At that instant Holmes sprang from the shadows. "Hold, sir! You are observed!" The figure recoiled with a cry, dropping the tool. In the next moment Lestrade flung himself forward, but the man slipped adroitly aside and darted toward the stairs. A furious struggle ensued in the half-light, during which the lantern was overturned and nearly extinguished. I caught but a glimpse of a pale, determined face beneath the cloak before the fellow struck Lestrade heavily and tore free. Holmes gave chase like a hound unleashed, his Inverness cape streaming behind him. I stumbled after, revolver drawn, but the pursuit was brief. At the head of the stairs the man collided with another shadow, one of Lestrade's men, stationed discreetly at Holmes's private request. With a cry the fugitive was borne down and secured. When we brought him into the crypt once more, the lantern revealed him to be none other than Mr. Cottle, the parish clerk. His round, genial face was contorted now with fury and fear, and the box clutched in his hand shook violently. "You fools!" he spat. "You know not what you meddle with. Better Briggs dead, better Pritchard too, than this secret loosed." Lestrade roared in triumph, clapping irons upon him. "By heavens, Holmes, we have him, the very man who confessed knowledge of Briggs's secret, and now caught red-handed with the evidence." Holmes, however, remained strangely calm. He regarded the prisoner with narrowed eyes, then turned deliberately away. "Do not be so swift, Inspector. The play is not yet finished." We conveyed the prisoner to Lestrade's custody, though at Holmes' insistence the box remained unopened and was placed in his own keeping. The inspector, flushed with success, could scarcely contain his glee. "It is as clear as daylight," he declared. "The clerk coveted whatever treasure lay in that crypt. Briggs found it, so he killed him. Pritchard threatened to speak, so he killed him also, and tonight he returned to secure the prize only to find us waiting. Case closed, Mr. Holmes." Holmes smiled faintly, yet his eyes were dark with thought. Closed, perhaps. And yet, why the candles? Why the play-acting with locked doors? A man greedy for treasure needs no such pageantry. No, Inspector, we have still to learn the meaning of this drama." Lestrade laughed derisively. "Always the dramatist yourself, Holmes. Well, the courts will have the truth of it. For my part, I am content." Holmes said no more, but when we returned to Baker Street near dawn, he sat long by the fire, the unopened box upon his knee. His fingers tapped ceaselessly upon the lid, and at intervals he muttered to himself. At last he turned to me. "Watson, what do you see?" "A wooden box, old and unremarkable." "Precisely. And yet men have died for it, Watson, died willingly, even eagerly. Briggs, Pritchard, and now Cottle, caught in the act of retrieving it. There is more here than greed. There is fear, fear powerful enough to clothe itself in ritual and strike down all who stood in the way." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "We stand upon the threshold, my friend. One more step, and the labyrinth opens. But tread carefully, for the path is perilous, and our adversary may not yet have played his final card. The dawn which followed our nocturnal adventure broke pale and reluctant over London. Though weary in body, Holmes refused sleep. He paced our sitting room with the unopened box ever in his hand, while I, aching in every limb, could scarce keep my eyes from closing. Lestrade, having conveyed his prisoner to Newgate, returned presently in buoyant spirits, convinced the affair was at an end. "A clean business, Mr. Holmes," he declared, rubbing his hands. "We have our culprit, the motive, and the evidence. The parish clerk will hang, and St. Swithin's will breathe again." Holmes halted abruptly, his eyes gleaming coldly. "And yet the parish trembles still, Inspector. Do you not hear the bells? Even now they toll as if in warning." "No, Lestrade, the play is not finished." Lestrade frowned. "You are never satisfied?" "Satisfaction belongs to fools," Holmes said curtly. "We pursue truth, not comfort. Ask yourself, why should a man of humble means and steady employment risk all for a trinket hidden behind a stone? Why twice cloak his deed in terror, arranging candles about his victims? Why lock doors against all reason, save to suggest the impossible?" "No, Inspector, the case is not so simple." Lestrade, vexed beyond measure, muttered oaths beneath his breath and soon departed, leaving Holmes and me alone. When at last I begged him to open the box, Holmes only shook his head. "Not yet, Watson. There is a time for revelation and a time for restraint. Knowledge released too soon may do greater harm than ignorance. I must first be certain of the hand that moved these pawns." I could not forbear a sigh of exasperation. "You play with shadows, Holmes. To me the matter is plain. Cottle slew Briggs and Pritchard to gain this prize. The candles were but a fanciful disguise." "Candles, Watson, are never fanciful when 5 are set in a circle," Holmes murmured. "They are the very voice of the deed. To interpret them is to read the message our adversary leaves. Until that message is understood, we walk blindfold." That afternoon, while Holmes remained absorbed in his thoughts, I ventured alone to St. Swithin's in the hope of gleaning some clearer sense of affairs. The graveyard was deserted, its sodden stones gleaming with recent rain. Yet within the church I found Sarah Briggs kneeling before the altar in prayer. She rose as I approached, her eyes red with weeping. "Dr. Watson, they say the clerk has been taken for my uncle's death. Is it true?" "It is true he was found in suspicious circumstance," I admitted. "Yet Holmes counsels caution. The matter may not be so straightforward." Her voice trembled. "Then you believe another may still be at large?" "I cannot say." She pressed her hands together. "My uncle was an innocent man. He would never have meddled with evil. Yet now all the parish whispers that he trafficked with spirits, that his death was punishment. If only you and Mr. Holmes could clear his name." I assured her of our best endeavours, though my own confidence was shaken. As I turned to depart, she clutched my arm. "One thing more, Doctor. Last night, when the storm abated, I looked from my window and saw a light moving among the graves. It was no lantern, for it glowed steady and white. I swear it descended toward the crypt, then vanished." Her words sent a chill through me. Could there still be another hand at work, unseen even as Cottle lay in irons? When I returned to Baker Street with this report, Holmes received it with fierce interest. "Just so, the play continues. The box is but one piece, and Cottle but one actor. There is a stage yet deeper." At that moment a constable arrived with news that startled even my imperturbable companion. While in custody, Cottle had collapsed in sudden convulsions. By the time aid arrived, he was dead. Lestrade himself brought confirmation within the hour. his face ashen. "Poison," he admitted grimly. "It must have been concealed upon his person. We searched him, but he found means. He's cheated the gallows." Holmes' eyes narrowed to slits. "Or was silenced. The difference is vital. Consider, Inspector, a man who risked all to secure a secret dies rather than speak. Did he choose it, or was the choice forced upon him?" Lestrade had no answer. He departed in haste to make his report, leaving Holmes and me once more in uneasy silence. That night, Holmes's restlessness grew intolerable. He paced without ceasing, his mind evidently racing. At last, he snatched up the box and thrust it beneath his arm. "Come, Watson, the time for shadows is done. We go once more to St. Swithin's." I followed, my heart heavy with foreboding. The church loomed dark and silent as we approached. Holmes led the way with sure steps, his lantern casting grotesque shapes upon the crypt walls. At the very spot where we had seized Cottle, he halted and set the box upon the floor. Then, with deliberate care, he produced from his pocket one of the candle stubs gathered at Pritchard's death. He set it in place upon the stone, lit it, and watched intently as the flame guttered in the damp air. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "the flame burns unnaturally steady. The air in this place does not move as it should. There is a draught, but not from door or stair." He moved to the wall and pressed his hand against the loosened stone. A faint current stirred the flame toward it. "An opening," he whispered. "A passage concealed beyond. Briggs discovered it. Pritchard, too, Cottle knew, and sought what lay within. For that they died. Tonight we shall see with our own eyes." With a swift motion he prized the stone further, revealing a narrow gap through which the draught sighed coldly. Beyond yawned a darkness blacker than night. "Courage, Watson," he said, his voice low but firm. "Here lies the heart of our mystery. Follow closely, for we tread into peril." And with that, lantern in hand, Sherlock Holmes stooped and passed into the hidden passage, leaving me no choice but to follow into the very bowels of St. Swithin's. The opening behind the stone yawned black and narrow, no wider than a man's shoulders. A damp draught sighed through it, cold as a tomb. Holmes lowered his lantern and peered within, his sharp features illuminated in flickering gold. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "how the flame bends inward. This passage breathes. It runs far beyond the bounds of this crypt. That alone explains the whisperings Briggs fancied he heard. Sound carries strangely in such channels." His tone was calm, almost casual, yet I could see the taut line of his mouth and the fierce glitter in his eyes. With a gesture, he motioned me to follow, then stooped and pressed himself into the opening. The lantern cast his shadow grotesquely against the stone, and in the next moment I, too, bent low and entered. The passage was close and suffocating, its walls, rough-hewn, pressed upon us like the ribs of some buried monster. Moisture dripped steadily and our footsteps echoed dully on the flagstones. After some yards the space widened, and we found ourselves in a low vaulted corridor running beneath the churchyard. Holmes halted to examine the ground. "Note, Watson, the dust is disturbed. Footsteps, many of them, some recent. Briggs was not the first to tread here, nor Cottle the last." "Then others still come and go?" "Precisely." We moved cautiously onward. The corridor twisted like a serpent, branching once to the left, then again to the right. Holmes chose without hesitation, guided by signs invisible to me, a faint scuff on the wall, a smear of soot upon the stone. Presently we reached a small chamber, square and vaulted, whose walls were lined with ancient niches. Within them rested bones long crumbled, the relics of centuries past. Yet what arrested my gaze was the arrangement upon the floor. 5 tall candles, burned low and guttered, set in a circle as before.
Holmes knelt and touched the wax. "Recent," he murmured. "Within the past 2 nights, our adversary was here." A shiver ran down my spine. But to what purpose? Why always 5? Holmes gave no answer. He rose and raised the lantern high, examining the walls. At last he found what he sought, a narrow stair descending steeply into the earth. Without hesitation, he began the descent, the lantern light casting quivering shadows upon the bones. We emerged into a second passage, lower and more ancient than the first. The air was thick with a foul odour, like stagnant water. I could scarcely breathe, and the silence pressed upon my ears until every drip and creak seemed thunderous. At length the passage widened into a crypt far larger than that above. Its roof was supported by massive pillars, green with slime, and along its length stood sarcophagi of stone. Here the lantern's glow seemed swallowed by the darkness, and I felt as though we had stepped into some underworld. Holmes moved swiftly among the pillars, examining the sarcophagi one by one. At one he paused, brushing away dust to reveal a carved crest. "Ah," he said quietly. "The arms of an old London guild, forgotten centuries ago. You perceive, Watson, this chamber is older than St. Swithin's itself. The church was built atop it, as is often the case. Such vaults were convenient for concealment." "Concealment of what?" "Patience, my dear fellow, patience." He pressed upon the lid of the sarcophagus. To my astonishment, it shifted with a hollow scrape. Beneath it yawned an aperture leading downward into yet deeper darkness. "Another stair," Holmes murmured. "This place is a warren." Before we could descend, however, a sudden sound arrested us both, the faint ring of a footfall, distant but unmistakable. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once, plunging us into total blackness. We stood motionless, scarcely daring to breathe. The footsteps drew nearer, echoing through the vault. A faint glow appeared, bobbing among the pillars, a lantern borne by some unseen hand. Presently a cloaked figure emerged, moving cautiously but with familiarity. He carried another bundle of candles, and he paused at the centre of the crypt to arrange them in the dreaded circle. Holmes's lips brushed my ear. "You see, Watson, our quarry multiplies. Cottle was not alone." "What shall we do?" I whispered. "Observe, for the moment." We watched in silence as the man lit the candles. Their glow revealed his features, sharp, hawk-like, with a beard streaked grey. Though partially obscured by his cloak, I recognized him with a jolt. It was the very charwoman's description made flesh, tall, cloaked, commanding. He knelt and prized at the sarcophagus Holmes had already discovered, working with rapid, sure strokes. When at last the stone gave way, he produced from within a small casket bound with iron. He lifted it reverently, almost fearfully, and muttered words I could not hear. Holmes moved then with the swiftness of a striking hawk. He sprang forward, seized the man's arm, and in an instant had wrenched the casket from his grasp. "Enough of this pageant," Holmes cried. "The law has eyes even in the dark." The man struggled fiercely, but I rushed to Holmes's aid, and between us we bore him to the ground. His lantern fell and guttered, leaving only the 5 candles to illuminate the dreadful scene. Pinned beneath Holmes's iron grip, the man glared up with eyes full of venom. "You do not understand," he spat. "Better Briggs dead, better Pritchard too, than the truth unsealed." Holmes's voice was cold as steel. "The truth is the one adversary you cannot slay, and it stands before you now." We bound the man with strips torn from his own cloak, and Holmes bore the iron-bound casket away. I expected him to open it then and there, but he shook his head. "Not here, Watson, not in this place. The air itself conspires with secrecy. We shall take it to Baker Street, where reason may prevail." We retraced our steps, dragging the prisoner between us.
More than once I glanced back into the darkness where the 5 candles still burned in their circle. Their glow flickered upon the ancient stones as though mocking us, and I felt an icy certainty that we had not yet plumbed the full depth of this mystery. At Baker Street near dawn, Lestrade met us, bleary-eyed but triumphant, at the news of another capture. The prisoner gave his name as Ezra Channing, a one-time solicitor now fallen into obscurity. His manner was proud, defiant, and when questioned about the deaths of Briggs and Pritchard, he only sneered. "You meddle in matters older than your precious yard," he said. "The dead guard their own. You would do well to leave them." Lestrade stormed, but Holmes silenced him with a gesture. "The law shall have its due, Mr. Channing, but first the truth shall speak." He laid the casket upon the table. Its iron bands were rusted but firm, its lock eaten away by time. With a swift movement, Holmes forced it open. Inside lay a sheaf of parchments brittle with age, and upon them the faded seal of a guild long dissolved. Holmes' eyes gleamed as he lifted them. "Ah, Watson," he said softly, "now we touch the heart of it. Here lies the secret for which men have killed and died, the secret hidden behind stones, veiled with candles, and guarded with blood. But not yet shall it be spoken." He closed the casket with deliberate care. "One step remains, and tomorrow we shall take it. Until then, silence. The game is not finished. The casket lay upon our table, its rusted bands prized apart, its contents spilling faintly of mildew and age. The dim light of our lamp shone upon parchment curled with centuries of sleep, the seals cracked, and the script faint but legible in the slanting hand of an older age. Holmes bent over them with eager intensity, his long fingers unrolling one sheet after another, his eyes darting with hawk-like swiftness. I hovered at his shoulder, striving to make sense of the faded lines, but the language was legal and archaic, bristling with phrases alien to me. "What are they, Holmes?" I asked at last. "Charters, Watson, charters and agreements of an ancient guild, a brotherhood of merchants long since forgotten. See here, clauses of secrecy, of burial, of oaths sworn beneath this very church. These parchments record not commerce alone, but conspiracy." "Conspiracy? To what end?" Holmes smiled thinly. "To the end that all conspiracies seek, profit, power, and silence. But mark this well. The parchments themselves are of little intrinsic value. It is what they signify that compels blood to be spilt." Lestrade, seated by the fire and yawning after the night's exertions, snorted impatiently. "Old papers, and men dead over them? Nonsense! Some cracked heads and overexcited fools, that's all." Holmes shot him a glance of withering contempt. "Fools, Inspector? Would fools slay twice with such precision? Would they risk discovery in the dead of night, cloaking their deeds with terror? No, no. We face cunning of the highest order, though cloaked in superstition." Our prisoner, Ezra Channing, sat under guard in the adjoining room. Twice I heard him laugh, a hollow, bitter sound that made my skin crawl. Holmes ignored him, though once he remarked, "That laughter, Watson, is the laugh of a man who believes he has won even in defeat." But how can that be? Because knowledge, once loosed, cannot be chained. Channing believes these parchments will speak even if his lips are sealed. He fell then into one of his long silences, pacing with hands clasped behind his back, his brows drawn in thought. At last he spoke. "Let us review, Watson, facts first, conclusions after. Briggs, the sexton, discovers the hidden passage. Troubled, he consults Cottle. Pritchard, the churchwarden, learns enough to alarm him. Each in turn is silenced, their deaths adorned with 5 candles, the doors secured from within.
Secured, I said slowly, to suggest impossibility. Exactly, an impossibility, Watson, is the ally of fear. The candles proclaim ritual, the locked door proclaims ghostly intervention. Together they weave a veil, but always the object was to divert attention from the wall, the passage, and at last this casket. And Cottle? Holmes' lips tightened. An accomplice, yes, but not the master. He was caught in the act, true, yet he played a lesser role. His death in custody proves as much. No, the true hand lies deeper. I was about to press him further when Mrs. Hudson entered with a message. A parish boy had come, pale with fright, declaring that strange lights were once more seen about St. Swithin's. Holmes's eyes gleamed. So, the play continues. Even with one in irons and another dead, the hand moves still. Watson, do you not perceive? The circle of 5 is unbroken. There are more players yet upon the stage. That evening, Holmes led us once more to the parish, though this time he trod with a curious restraint, as though every step was a test of some hypothesis forming within his mind. We reached the graveyard just as the mist began to rise, and there indeed we saw a faint glow issuing from beneath the yew trees. Holmes motioned us to silence and advanced stealthily, his lantern shaded. Presently we espied a figure bent low beside the crypt, arranging what at first I took for offerings of flowers, but as we drew closer, the glimmer revealed itself to be candles, 5 once again, set in a half-circle upon the stones. The figure straightened. To my astonishment, it was none other than Sarah Briggs. She started violently at our sudden appearance, the blood draining from her face. "Mr. Holmes," she gasped, I did not hear you." Holmes regarded her with that piercing gaze which seemed to strip away all pretense. "You were warned not to meddle, Miss Briggs, and yet here you are, repeating the very pattern that heralded death. What explanation have you?" She trembled, wringing her hands. "It is not as it seems. My uncle, he believed the candles kept the voices at bay. He told me so when I was a child. I thought, if I lit them, perhaps his spirit would rest." Lestrade uttered an exclamation of triumph. "There's our answer. The girl herself is tangled in it." But Holmes silenced him with a gesture. "No, Inspector. This is but the echo of belief, not the hand that struck. Still, it proves how deep the superstition runs." Sarah burst into tears. "I meant no harm. I only wished for peace." Holmes bowed slightly. "Peace is found not in candlelight but in truth. Go home, Miss Briggs. Leave the rest to us." When she had gone, Holmes turned to us with sudden vehemence. "You see now the cleverness of our adversary. By weaving superstition into every corner, they ensure that even innocence becomes complicit. The very niece of the victim spreads the ritual, believing it holy. Thus does fear perpetuate itself." We descended once more into the crypt, Holmes moving swiftly, lantern in hand. At the loosened wall he paused. "This passage is not the end, Watson. It is the beginning. Beyond these stones lies not merely a hoard of parchments, but a secret worth silencing. Tonight we shall reach its heart," Lestrade muttered nervously, but Holmes pressed on, leading us again into the subterranean corridors. The candles still guttered where Channing had left them, their wax long cooled. The air was close, foul with decay, but Holmes strode unflinching, his eyes alight with purpose. At last we reached the great sarcophagus where the casket had been hidden. Holmes examined it anew, then tapped upon its base with his stick. A hollow echo answered. "You hear it, Watson? This tomb is false. Beneath it lies yet another chamber, the true vault of this brotherhood." With our aid he shifted the stone lid aside. A narrow stair descended into the black. Holmes lifted the lantern, and his voice rang low but firm. "Here, gentlemen, is the last step. When we descend, the labyrinth will yield its secret. The veil of the candles shall be torn aside, and then, Watson, the web shall be revealed entire. We descended the stair, revealed beneath the sarcophagus. Our lanterns glow, trembling upon stone steps, slick with damp. The air grew colder as we pressed downward, until at last the passage widened into a vault of considerable breadth, hewn from the living rock. Here lay chests mouldered with age, and upon the walls the faded symbols of a long-forgotten guild, compasses, balances, and merchants' marks etched deep into the stone. Holmes raised the lantern high. "Behold, Watson, the hidden treasury of the Guild of Candlewrights, once a brotherhood both wealthy and powerful. Centuries ago they concealed their charters, their oaths, and perhaps their ill-gotten gains beneath St. Swithin's. The world forgot them, but their vault remained, guarded by secrecy." Lestrade whistled low. "And Briggs stumbled on it?" "Just so. Briggs, the faithful sexton, heard voices through the draught, saw glimmers of light when others worked by night in this place. He pried loose the stone, and with it loosed the peril that destroyed him." "But the deaths?" I asked. "Why the candles? Why the locked doors?" Holmes turned to us, his face alive with the fire of revelation. "The candles were the guild's emblem, Watson. 5 flames for the 5 founders, ever arranged in a circle. When Briggs was slain, his body was adorned with this mark to terrify the parish and divert suspicion. Pritchard, the churchwarden, likewise fell because he had learned too much. And in both cases the locked doors completed the illusion, deaths wrought by unseen hands as though spirits had avenged the secret." He paced before us, his voice rising. "But there were no spirits, there was craft. The doors were bolted by a simple device. A length of cord passed through the keyhole, the bolt drawn from without, and the cord withdrawn. A trick of locksmiths centuries old. To Lestrade it seemed impossible. To the guilty it was child's play." Lestrade coloured, but said nothing. Holmes pointed to the iron-bound casket we had recovered. These parchments were their prize, within our records of dealings that would shame the names of London's oldest houses, bribery, fraud, the kind of legacy that, if published, would ruin fortunes and reputations still lingering today. That is why Channing himself, sprung from one of those families, sought to recover them. He cloaked his quest in ritual to frighten the curious. Cottle, the clerk, was his ally, bribed or compelled to assist. Together they wove this pageant of superstition. But greed breeds discord. Cottle faltered, and so he was silenced. Channing remained, but in the end his hand was forced. I stared in astonishment. "Then Channing is the true culprit?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Culprit, yes, but not alone. Others in the city, whose names you will not find in court, lent him aid. They feared exposure more than justice, and they armed him with threats, with poison, with coin. He was their instrument, yet, as always, instruments break." He placed a hand upon the sarcophagus. "Briggs, poor fellow, was guilty of nothing but curiosity. His death was staged to suggest blasphemy. Pritchard too perished, not for vice, but because he held a key, and so the circle of 5 candles became their shroud." We returned to Baker Street that dawn with the parchment secure, and the prisoner delivered to Lestrade's custody. After some hours' rest, Holmes at last seated himself opposite me, and delivered the final summation in his calm, deliberate manner, as though lecturing upon a point of science. "You see, Watson, how each step led to the next." The whisperings in the crypt were but echoes through the hidden passage. The lights Palmer the beggar swore he saw were candles set by conspirators, not phantoms. The locked doors were contrivances, the threats mere warnings penned to fan the flame of fear.
At every stage, reason sufficed, yet fear blinded all but those who would see. And the soil? I recalled. Ah, the reddish clay upon Palmer's boots. That clay exists only where barges unload near the Thames embankment. Our guild had its secret entrance there, long disused but known to Channing. Palmer strayed upon it and paid dearly for his curiosity. Holmes' eyes twinkled. Thus the circle closes, Watson. Candles, locks, parchments, threats, all resolved into human cunning, not supernatural malice. Yet observe the cunning. They dressed murder in the trappings of ritual to blind the mind with terror. That, my dear fellow, was their master stroke. Lestrade, though still reluctant, was forced to concede. Well, Mr. Holmes, I'll grant you this. It's devilish clever, and I'll not hear another word of spectres after this. Holmes inclined his head, a smile hovering at the corner of his lips. Spectres, Inspector, are seldom more than shadows cast by guilty men, and yet how willingly the world believes in them. That evening, as we sat once more before the fire of Baker Street, I could not but reflect upon the strange case. The image of those 5 candles burned still in my mind, their flames guttering in the crypt's darkness. Holmes, I said, was it truly necessary to let Sarah Briggs believe her uncle's fears were but fancy? She seemed so shaken. Holmes gazed into the fire. Better she remember him as a man of faith than as a victim of ruthless men. Truth has many layers, Watson. Sometimes the gentler one is best left. He rose, stretched his long limbs, and reached for his violin. And now, my dear fellow, another case will soon present itself, and the world will again imagine mystery, where only reason dwells. Meanwhile, let us have music. The mind, like the body, requires balance. As he drew the bow across the strings, the solemn notes filled our rooms, and I set down the last of my notes with a mixture of awe and relief. Once again, Sherlock Holmes had lifted the veil of fear to reveal the clear light of reason, and once again I marvelled that a man so austere could yet be the champion of truth in a world so eager for shadows. The days which followed saw the quiet unravelling of the conspiracy that had cast its shadow over St. Swithin's. Ezra Channing, the solicitor-turned-conspirator, was held at Newgate on charges of murder, though Holmes maintained to the last that he had been but one figure in a darker company. Cottle, dead in his cell, would speak no more, yet his part was plain enough from the evidence. Lestrade, for once, had the wit to move cautiously. He produced the parchments under seal and placed them in the custody of the Home Office, who, after hurried examination, declared them to be of historic but negligible interest. Holmes laughed at this pronouncement. "Negligible to them, Watson," he said, "because no government enjoys stirring the dust of ancient corruption. Better to let sleeping guilds lie than to risk shaking reputations that still enjoy influence. But I do not begrudge them their diplomacy. Justice is not always best served by daylight. We may be content that those who sought to slay in the dark are themselves unmasked." The parish of St. Swithin's, relieved of its burden, soon returned to its accustomed peace. The crypt was sealed and declared unfit for use. The sexton's name, once whispered with suspicion, was cleared in the eyes of his flock. Sarah Briggs, grateful beyond words, came to Baker Street to thank Holmes in person. "I shall never forget your kindness," she said, tears standing in her eyes. "You restored my uncle's honour when all others doubted him." Holmes, with his usual brusqueness, bowed her from the room, and when the door closed, he remarked only, "It is a poor sort of justice that cannot reach the dead, but perhaps consolation for the living is worth the effort." I marvelled at his words, for in them lay a softness he seldom allowed to surface. One evening, as I sat writing these notes, I turned to Holmes. There is one point I still cannot reconcile. Why always 5 candles, and why the circle?" Holmes smiled, stretching lazily in his chair. "A question of theatre, Watson. The Guild of Candlewrights carried 5 as their sacred number. Channing and his accomplices revived it to give weight to their masquerade. But more than that, a circle of 5 flames placed about a corpse excites the imagination more than any knife or pistol. The very strangeness of it ensured silence, for who dares speak of what he cannot explain? It was the most economical of terrors. And yet it failed. Because, my dear fellow, terror may deceive the eye, but never the trained reasoner. To one who sees, each candle was but a signpost, 5 lights pointing toward one truth, that men fear shadows, and in fear lies the criminal's first refuge. In the weeks that followed, Holmes resumed his habitual life. Clients came and went, the violin sang once more in our rooms, the newspapers speculated wildly upon the Crypt candle's mystery, weaving ghost stories fit to frighten old women. Holmes read these accounts with sardonic amusement. "They call me magician, sorcerer, even necromancer," he remarked one morning, tossing aside a particularly lurid column. "It never occurs to them that the simplest tool is reason. Yet perhaps it is better so. A legend serves where plain truth would be ignored." I could not help but smile. "You may dismiss legend, Holmes, but to me you remain the most extraordinary man alive." He waved the compliment aside. "Extraordinary? Nonsense. I am but a mirror polished to reflect facts others will not see. Remember that, Watson. No flame burns but for want of fuel. No candle stands but for the hand that sets it upright. Trace the fuel, trace the hand, and the mystery ceases. It is simplicity itself." And so ended the strange affair of the 5 candles, though the parchments remain locked in some government vault, and though the name of the guild is already fading once more into obscurity, I cannot forget the chill of those subterranean chambers, nor the sight of Briggs and Pritchard lying cold within their circles of flame. Yet more enduring than any horror is the memory of Holmes himself, his calm in the presence of fear, his relentless pursuit of reason through every shadow, his genius for stripping away deception to reveal the simple human truth. It is a lesson I have often pondered, that in a world so quick to believe in ghosts and curses, the greatest light is that of clear thought. And in Sherlock Holmes that light shines brightest of all,